The age before ice. Welcome to the lukewarm past. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Sleepless History Therapy, the show where we learn just enough about the past to make you feel oddly grateful for the present. So, tonight, dim your lights, pull that blanket up, maybe grab a midnight snack, preferably one that's not rotting in a barrel somewhere, because we're about to float gently back into a world without refrigerators. Yep, before electricity, before freezers, before the luxury of saying, "Ugh, my ice cream melted." We're talking about how people, for thousands of years, managed to keep food from turning into a festering fly-infested science experiment. Spoiler, it wasn't easy. You'll find it oddly comforting to know that everyone, peasants, nobles, and emperors alike, fought the same eternal enemy: decay. That smell in your kitchen when you forget a bag of potatoes for too long? Imagine that, but everywhere. Welcome to pre-refrigeration Europe. So, tonight, we're going to wander through cellars, salt mines, ice pits, and medieval kitchens filled with questionable odors and surprisingly smart solutions. And maybe, by the end, you'll never complain about your fridge being too full again. All right, let's start at the beginning, with the oldest trick in the preservation book. Salt, the original fridge in a rock. Before modern preservatives, salt was king. Not metaphorically, literally. Empires were built on it. Wars were fought over it. Roman soldiers were even paid in it, hence the word salary. So yes, people once got their paycheck in a pile of salt, which honestly feels kind of poetic given how flavorless most medieval food was. Salt works because it draws water out of food and out of bacteria. Less moisture means less microbial party time. Meat, fish, cheese, all could be packed in layers of coarse salt and survive months, sometimes even years. But, of course, nothing came easy. Salt wasn't cheap. It had to be mined or evaporated from seawater, which meant coastal cities got rich, while inland villages just, well, hoped for the best. In England, entire towns like Droitwich existed just for salt production. The brine there was so salty, you could float a chicken in it. Not that anyone was wasting good chicken like that. In colder regions, salted meats became the cornerstone of winter survival. Beef, pork, even eels, all got dunked into brine barrels, sealed and stored in cool cellars. By the time spring rolled around, they were technically edible, but let's just say texture wasn't a concept yet. Imagine slicing into something that's both beef jerky and wet sponge at the same time. That was dinner. And it wasn't just meat. Salt-preserved fish, like cod, became an international trade sensation. The Vikings, the Basquists, and the Portuguese basically ran the medieval seafood scene. Salted cod was durable, lightweight, and could travel across oceans without rotting. So if you ever wondered what medieval sailors were chewing on during month-long voyages, yeah, it was salted fish. Forever. But salt wasn't the only hero here. Let's float over to something a little colder. Icehouses, when winter was your freezer subscription. Now, not everyone had access to glaciers, but those who did, oh boy, they milked that privilege. Long before refrigerators, people figured out that ice could keep food fresh. Simple, right? Except, of course, the ice only existed for a few months each year. In ancient Persia, they built massive cone-shaped structures called yakshas, basically early refrigerators made from clay and natural insulation. They'd collect ice from nearby mountains during winter and store it underground, packed in straw and sawdust, and somehow it stayed frozen until summer. So while European peasants were trying to salt their cabbages into submission, Persian nobles were sipping chilled drinks in July. Civilizations really had different priorities. By the Renaissance, the idea spread across Europe. Wealthy estates started building icehouses, thick-walled stone chambers dug deep underground, often hidden in shady parts of the garden. Servants would haul in giant ice blocks during winter and stack them like prehistoric freezer trays. The ice would last well into summer, allowing for something truly luxurious: frozen cream and fruit sorbets. Meanwhile, their servants were sweating outside, salting herring to survive. Balance, I suppose. But ice storage wasn't just for indulgence. It also kept meat from spoiling and milk from turning. In big houses, the kitchen staff would take daily trips to the ice house, chipping off just enough to cool whatever needed cooling. Of course, if you were poor, your ice house was just the ground. The cold ground. Peasant Refrigeration 101. Let's be honest, most medieval people didn't have a stone vault full of imported ice. Their best option was a cool, dark hole in the earth. And, to be fair, it kind of worked. The ground temperature stays relatively stable year-round, especially a few feet below the surface. So farmers stored root vegetables, carrots, turnips, potatoes once they showed up from the New World, and beets in pits lined with straw. These root cellars were basically nature's slow cooker, but in reverse. You dig a hole, dump your harvest, cover it with straw and sawdust, and hope no rats RSVP'd to the buffet. In Northern Europe, families often had a little underground chamber near their cottages. It was damp, dark, and smelled like everything inside had once been alive. But it kept food edible for months, which was all that mattered. Fruit got the same treatment. Apples, pears, even onions were stored in layers, carefully checked for rot, because one bad apple literally did spoil the bunch. And if you didn't have a cellar, you got creative, hanging smoked sausages in chimneys, burying cabbages in the snow, or submerging butter in jars of cold water. The medieval motto was basically, if it doesn't move, it's preserved. Smoke and fire. Cooking as preservation. Here's the thing. Refrigeration is just one way to fight rot. The other is fire. People have been smoking meat since prehistory. It's simple chemistry. Smoke dries the food and coats it in compounds that slow bacterial growth. It also adds flavor, which was a nice bonus when most medieval meals tasted like damp wool. Smoked bacon, ham, and sausages were common across Europe. The smell of smoke wasn't just comforting, it was survival itself. In a typical medieval kitchen, the rafters doubled as drying racks. Strips of meat hung above the fireplace, slowly turning brown and leathery over weeks. The air was thick, the walls blackened, and the cooks half blind from smoke. But the food lasted, which was the whole point. Fish was smoked too. Eels, trout, herring, anything you could catch before it caught something worse. Even cheese got the smoke treatment. And while smoked cheese sounds fancy now, back then it was just, well, functional. A side effect of living in a kitchen that never stopped burning wood. So between salting, drying, and smoking, people could stretch their harvests through the brutal winters. But those methods only worked if you had access to food in the first place. Which brings us to a slightly more desperate technique. Fermentation. Controlled rot. Emphasis on controlled. When all else failed, medieval people turned to bacteria, but the good kind. Fermentation was magic before science explained it. They noticed that wine, beer, and sauerkraut didn't spoil the way fresh fruit or meat did, so they leaned into it hard. Fermented foods became staples because they were self-preserving. Cabbage became sauerkraut. Milk became cheese or yogurt. Grapes became wine. Barley became beer. Basically, if it could rot, they found a way to make that rot taste good. And yes, people were fully aware of the side effects, namely mild intoxication. But given the state of medieval water supplies, fermented beverages were actually safer to drink than plain water. So kids drank beer too, just the weak kind. Because nothing says family dinner like everyone being a little tipsy and smelling faintly of yeast. Fermentation didn't just preserve, it transformed. It made bland foods rich, tangy, and filling, and it made life a little more bearable when everything else around you was dying of mold. So while the rich had icehouses and the poor had dirt holes, everyone had a barrel of something quietly bubbling in the corner. Next, we'll drift into how food preservation shaped entire cultures, empires, and social hierarchies. Because believe it or not, your jar of pickles once helped build global trade routes. Let's float there slowly. Empires built on salt and ice. All right, welcome back. I hope you've adjusted to the gentle hum of medieval food anxiety. We've salted, smoked, and fermented our way through dinner. Now let's zoom out a little. Because food preservation wasn't just about staying alive, it was about power, wealth, and control. The ability to keep food fresh, or at least edible, decided who ruled comfortably and who starved dramatically. So let's float through some empires built, quite literally, on salt and cold air. Salt roads and kingdoms of white gold. Salt, yes again, wasn't just seasoning. It was currency, leverage, and sometimes even the reason your neighbor invaded you. Take medieval Europe. Every major power had a salt economy somewhere under the royal crown. The French monarchy, for instance, had the gabelle, a heavy salt tax so unpopular that people rioted over it for centuries. It was one of the many reasons the French Revolution eventually exploded. Imagine being so mad about salt that you start chopping off royal heads. That's how essential it was. Meanwhile, Venice, glamorous, mysterious, perpetually damp Venice, became a maritime powerhouse largely because it controlled the salt trade routes. Ships loaded with Venetian salt sailed across the Mediterranean, bartering it for grain, spices, and fabrics. They didn't just trade salt, they used it to preserve fish that could then be traded again. It was a self-sustaining cycle of salty capitalism. Up north, places like Lüneburg in Germany built massive salt works. The town became so rich that their skyline glittered with Gothic spires and warehouses full of brine. And in Africa, the mighty Mali Empire literally ran on salt. Caravans would cross the Sahara with slabs of salt balanced on camels, trading them ounce for ounce with gold. It sounds absurd now, trading rock for metal, but back then, salt could keep your family alive through a dry season. Gold couldn't. Salt was the quiet backbone of civilization. No glamour, just grit, sweat, and the occasional salt riot. But while some places were digging salt from the ground, others were pulling ice from nature's freezer. The frozen luxury, ice for the rich. If salt was the working man's preservation method, ice was the elite's party trick. By the 17th century, Europe's upper classes were obsessed with serving cold food and drink precisely because it was so impractical. Nothing screams wealth like owning a block of frozen water in July. Ice harvesting became a whole seasonal industry. In winter, workers carved huge blocks from lakes and rivers, dragged them by sled or wagon, and stored them in insulated pits lined with straw. Then, months later, that same ice might appear in a Venetian banquet hall, chilling a crystal bowl of fruit or keeping the king's wine just slightly less warm than his temper. Even in hot climates, people found ways. In Mughal India, emperors built elaborate systems using night frost, shade, and clever insulation to produce small quantities of ice. The results were brought to royal courts by morning, fragile little miracles that melted in hours. So yes, while most people were praying their salted beef didn't turn green, royalty was complaining that their sorbet melted too fast. It's not that the rich didn't understand preservation, they just had different priorities. Which brings us to an entire profession dedicated to that obsession. The keepers of cool, medieval food servants. Inside castles and manors, preserving food wasn't just an act of survival. It was a logistical nightmare disguised as a job title. You had larders, not the shelves, but the actual rooms, cool chambers for meats guarded like treasure vaults. And then you had the larderer, the poor soul responsible for maintaining it. There was also the spicery, the bodily, the pantry, and even the ice chamber, depending on how ridiculous your estate was. Each had its own keeper. The larderer's daily routine? Check the meat barrels, replace brine if needed, inspect for worms, chase out the occasional rat, and pray the Duke didn't order venison for dinner when it had gone a bit off. Spoilage was inevitable, so servants learned creative deception. A roast gone slightly sour? Drown it in vinegar, garlic, and cloves. Congratulations, you've just invented medieval barbecue sauce. In fact, much of medieval seasoning culture came from necessity, not taste. Spices masked decay, salt prolonged denial, and nobody asked too many questions at dinner. Because back then, every meal was a gamble between hunger and botulism. The royal tables of preservation pride. Let's drift into a royal banquet hall for a moment. Candles flickering, tapestries sagging slightly from moisture, servants balancing silver platters heavy with questionable delights. The medieval elite prided themselves on abundance, not freshness. Food piled high, glistening under candlelight, wasn't meant to be eaten entirely. It was performance art. You might have peacocks roasted and then redressed in their own feathers, or pies filled with live birds that flew out when cut open, because apparently nobody could just enjoy normal dinner conversation. These dishes weren't exactly safe, but they looked impressive. That was the point. In a world where everyone knew how hard it was to keep food fresh, showing you could afford to waste it was the ultimate flex. Ironically, many royal kitchens had decent preservation systems, vast underground storerooms, ice wells, and barrels of salt fish from the Baltic. But the king's actual meal might still have been lukewarm, oily, and 2 days past its prime. So while servants carefully rotated supplies in the cellars, the nobility happily dined on decorative decadence and mild indigestion.
Pickled power and portable food. Let's step out of the castle for a second, onto the battlefield, because preservation wasn't just about dinner parties, it was military strategy. Armies couldn't survive without preserved food. Salted pork, dried peas, and hardtack, that brick-like bread sailors and soldiers gnawed on, kept campaigns moving long after local supplies ran out. The Romans had mastered this centuries earlier with salted rations and vinegar-based sauces. By the Middle Ages, that tradition continued. Knights marching to war carried little bundles of dried meat or smoked fish. Pickling was crucial too. Vinegar wasn't just a flavoring, it was antiseptic. Soldiers washed wounds with it, cleaned gear with it, and ate from the same barrels that stored pickled onions. Deliciously efficient. And because portable food meant power, every kingdom tried to perfect it. The Vikings had dried fish, the Mongols had fermented mare's milk and jerky like dried mutton. Japanese samurai packed rice balls with pickled plums. So in a way, global history was just a series of people trying not to die from hunger while marching somewhere else. The smell of preservation, a medieval aroma. If you could bottle the scent of the medieval world, you'd probably regret it. But it's worth imagining. The air in a kitchen was thick with smoke and brine. Salted pork hanging from beams, herbs drying by the fire, a faint note of vinegar, maybe a whiff of stale ale. Then outside, the
The sweet, sour smell of fermenting cabbage from every household barrel. It wasn't pleasant by modern standards, but to them, it was the smell of security. If it smelled strong, it meant it wouldn't rot tomorrow. And ironically, those preserved foods created entire cuisines. Sauerkraut in Germany, salted cod in Portugal, smoked hams in Italy, all born out of the need to cheat time. It's comforting, really, to think that humanity's greatest delicacies started as desperate survival hacks. The arrival of ice trade, when the world got cooler. By the 1800s, everything changed. Ice stopped being a luxury and became an industry. Enter the ice trade, a bizarre, heroic chapter of global commerce. In the 19th century, an American entrepreneur named Frederick Tudor, later nicknamed the Ice King, decided to export ice from New England to the tropics. Actual frozen blocks shipped to the Caribbean, India, and beyond. It sounds insane, but it worked. Ships insulated with sawdust carried thousands of tons of ice across oceans, and people in Calcutta were suddenly sipping chilled drinks courtesy of a frozen lake in Massachusetts. This revolution didn't just cool drinks, it transformed preservation forever. Meat, milk, and fish could now be stored for weeks without salt. Urban populations exploded because food could finally travel long distances safely. And that, in turn, set the stage for the ultimate invention, the home refrigerator. But before we chill there, pun absolutely intended, let's take a gentle detour through the cultural side of all this, how preservation didn't just change diets, it shaped beliefs, trade routes, and even holidays. Let's float onward.
Faith, festivals, and food that wouldn't die. Welcome back. Let's keep drifting through the past, softly, slowly, where religion, ritual, and sheer human stubbornness all shaped what people ate and how long it lasted. Because food wasn't just survival, it was spiritual, it was political, and sometimes it was a centuries-long misunderstanding involving moldy bread and divine miracles. So dim your metaphorical lantern. Let's wander into a world where fasting met feasting, and rotting food was sometimes considered holy. Faith on a shelf. Religion meets preservation. In medieval Europe, religion ruled the pantry. The church dictated when you could eat meat, when you couldn't, and how much indulgence your stomach could handle before it became a sin. Fasting days were everywhere. Lent, Advent, Fridays, vigils. Basically, half the calendar was a gentle, no-meat reminder. And that meant fish. Mountains of it. Salted, smoked, dried, pickled, or just questionably rehydrated fish. Entire industries grew from the church's dietary laws. The North Sea became a floating gold mine. Cod fisheries in Norway, Iceland, and later Newfoundland thrived because Europe needed something to chew on between confessions. Monasteries, too, were hubs of preservation. Monks brewed beer for hydration and, let's be honest, morale. They made cheese that could last for months. They dried fruits and pressed oils. Their food had to last through long winters and longer prayers. And because monks documented everything, much of what we know about early preservation comes from their neat Latin notes in the margins. Salted well, smelled fine in March, or Brother Thomas got sick again. Faith and food were inseparable. You didn't just eat, you atoned, you fasted, and occasionally you fermented. And sometimes that fermentation crossed into something almost magical. Holy cheese and blessed bread. Picture a monastery deep in the Alps. Snow outside, candles flickering inside, shelves lined with wheels of cheese so aged they probably had their own confessions to make.
Monks accidentally discovered that letting milk sit a little too long under the right conditions created something delicious instead of disastrous. That's how we got cheeses like Gruyere, Emmental, and even blue cheese, all products of microbial patience and divine timing. People back then didn't understand bacteria, of course, so when food aged gracefully instead of rotting horribly, they assumed divine intervention, hence holy cheese. The same happened with bread. Certain loaves lasted longer when made with natural sourdough starters, a self-sustaining yeast community that medieval bakers lovingly tended like pets. If your bread didn't mold too fast, you thanked God. If it did, well, maybe you'd sinned. Food preservation wasn't science. It was faith and superstition kneaded together. Now let's glide toward the festive side, because medieval people didn't just store food, they celebrated it too, especially when it was about to spoil. Harvest festivals were timed perfectly, right before winter, when fresh produce was abundant but short-lived. So people feasted, drank, and danced, partly out of gratitude for provisions and partly out of sheer desperation to eat everything before it rotted. In Europe, Michaelmas, Martinmas, and countless local feasts revolved around slaughtering animals and preserving the meat. Salting and smoking took days, and everyone helped. The smell of curing meat filled villages, a kind of unofficial announcement. Winter's coming, better pickle something. Even Christmas, that beacon of comfort food, owes much to preservation. Mince pies, fruit cakes, puddings, all designed to last weeks or months. Spices, alcohol, and sugar weren't just flavor, they were protection. Nothing said Merry Christmas like food you'd technically cooked in November.
Pickling as philosophy. Pickling wasn't just a kitchen trick, it was a worldview. To pickle something was to say, I refuse to let nature win today. Vinegar, salt, or brine, these were weapons against time. From Korea's kimchi jars to Eastern Europe's pickle barrels, the process carried deep cultural meaning. In many Asian households, making pickles was a seasonal ritual, often communal, even spiritual. Families gathered to salt cabbage, radish, or mango, chatting about life while the future meal quietly fermented nearby. Those jars were living things. They changed, evolved, and sometimes rebelled. If a pickle went wrong, people said it had a bad mood. And honestly, that feels accurate. The beauty of pickling is that it didn't demand perfection. It rewarded patience. A little time, a little salt, and something bland became something brilliant. Just like most of human history, really. The spices that saved empires. Let's drift towards something more fragrant now, the spice trade. Before refrigeration, spices weren't luxury flavorings, they were tools of survival. Pepper, cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, all of them masked the less-than-fresh taste of meat and extended the illusion of edibility. Europe became obsessed. Entire voyages were launched to secure spice routes. Wars were fought, fortunes made. The irony? All this global chaos over ingredients originally meant to hide decay. By the 15th century, spices were so valuable that nutmeg from the Banda Islands could be traded for land in Europe. Literally. The Dutch swapped Manhattan for a tiny Indonesian island because of nutmeg. Imagine explaining that to New Yorkers today. Spices didn't stop food from spoiling entirely, but they delayed the inevitable and made it smell better on the way down. Fermentation and the accidental alchemy. Fermentation, the quiet art of letting microbes do the hard work, is humanity's oldest and most successful preservation trick. From beer to miso,
yogurt to sauerkraut, it's basically the process of controlled rot. You just had to believe in the process enough not to throw it away mid-transformation. Every culture had its version. Europeans fermented cabbage, Asians fermented soybeans, Africans fermented grains into porridges and beers. Even ancient Egyptians made fermented fish paste, not unlike modern-day anchovy sauce. Fermentation wasn't just about food, it was philosophy. You gave nature a nudge, stepped back, and trusted the invisible. It's oddly poetic and slightly terrifying how much of our diet depends on letting things just go wrong enough. The quiet triumph before refrigeration. By the 19th century, humanity had mastered the art of tricking nature. Icehouses lined with straw, pressure-sealed tins, glass jars with wax seals, salt, vinegar, sugar, smoke, all in harmony. Every technique, refined over millennia, pointed toward the same dream: food that didn't fight back. When the first mechanical refrigerators appeared, it wasn't an invention from scratch, it was the final, humming note in a long symphony of survival. Generations had learned to dry, brine, smoke, and ferment. And suddenly, a metal box did it all silently. Progress, of course, came with irony. Once refrigeration became common, many of those ancient skills faded away. People forgot how to cure bacon or make sauerkraut. The art of patience was replaced by the convenience of a humming compressor. Still, somewhere in a quiet village, someone's grandmother is salting fish by hand, doing exactly what their ancestors did 1,000 years ago. Because the story of food preservation isn't really about technology, it's about continuity, about humans refusing to let dinner, or history, go quietly into the night. And that's where we'll rest for tonight. You floated through salt mines and monasteries, ice pits and pickle jars. You've met kings, monks, and mildly desperate peasants, all bound by one obsession: keeping food just edible enough to make it to tomorrow. Next time, maybe we'll drift into the strange world of royal hygiene myths, or why everyone smelled like a candle factory.
Ice, insanity, and the art of pretending you have a fridge. Welcome back, Night Owl. If you're still here, congratulations! You've officially outlasted most of history's food. We've salted, smoked, and prayed our way through centuries of questionable cuisine. Now, let's wander softly into the era when people began to fake refrigeration. Long before the electric hum of your modern fridge, there was sheer human stubbornness, ingenuity, and occasionally, plain madness. So let's dim the lantern again, loosen the mental corset, and drift into the world of ice cellars, snow shipments, and early science experiments gone weirdly wrong. When winter became a commodity. It sounds absurd now, but for much of history, ice was a luxury item, a rare, glittering miracle that only the rich could afford to store and brag about. Before mechanical cooling, people had to literally chase winter. Ancient Persians, for example, built yakhchals, massive cone-shaped structures that could store ice year-round. Think of a giant beehive made of clay and science. They used clever ventilation, insulation, and a whole lot of desert engineering to keep the inside cool, even under brutal heat. In Europe, meanwhile, nobles dug underground icehouses, basically fancy pits lined with straw and brick. During the cold months, servants would haul blocks of ice from nearby rivers, wrap them in sawdust or hay, and bury them in the cellar like treasure. Because, in a way, it was treasure. Imagine walking into your candlelit dining hall in July and casually asking for chilled wine. That's how you said, "Yes, I own peasants." The Great Ice Trade, shipping winter around the world. By the 19th century, someone finally asked, what if we sold ice? Enter Frederick Tudor, the self-declared Ice King of America. In the early 1800s, Tudor began harvesting ice from frozen lakes in New England and shipping it, yes, shipping it, to tropical places like the Caribbean, India, and Brazil. It sounds insane, but he actually made it work. Using sawdust as insulation, Tudor managed to deliver usable ice halfway across the planet. Picture this: a sweaty merchant in Calcutta in 1835, sipping on a drink cooled by a chunk of Massachusetts winter. That was globalization before the internet, or even the telegraph. Of course, shipping frozen water across the ocean wasn't cheap, but it made Tudor fabulously wealthy, and, arguably, the first man in history to prove that people will always pay extra to be slightly more comfortable. Even Queen Victoria got in on the ice craze. She reportedly enjoyed cold desserts in mid-summer, probably while her staff silently cursed the logistics behind it. The early science of cold and few explosions. Eventually, humanity decided hauling frozen rivers wasn't sustainable. Enter the early refrigeration pioneers, part inventor, part mad scientist. In the 18th and 19th centuries, chemists began experimenting with gases that could absorb heat and cool air. Unfortunately, they had no idea most of those gases were also toxic or explosive. Some early prototypes leaked ammonia, ether, or even sulfur dioxide into homes. It kept the butter cool and occasionally killed the canary. The first successful mechanical refrigeration system appeared in the 1850s, used mostly in breweries and meatpacking plants. It wasn't for comfort, it was for commerce. Beer and beef demanded consistency. Domestic fridges came much later, and even then, they were more dangerous than helpful. Some used methyl chloride, which, when it leaked, caused fatal accidents. It wasn't until the 1920s that the safer Freon-based refrigerator became standard. And that, dear listener, is when humans finally won their centuries-long war against room-temperature milk. Meanwhile, back in the countryside, while inventors were poisoning themselves in laboratories, most rural families kept doing what they'd always done, trusting the ground. Root cellars were the unsung heroes of human survival. Cool, damp, and dark, they were nature's refrigerators long before wires or compressors existed. Farmers buried their harvests underground. Potatoes, carrots, apples, cabbages, everything got layered with straw and dirt. If you walked into a good cellar, it smelled of earth and quiet confidence. Even in the 19th century, families relied on these cool spaces to stretch their food supply through the winter. The system was simple: eat what's on top first, and hope you never discover what's decomposing at the bottom.
Luxury at the dinner table. The arrival of ice cream and cold puddings. With ice now a global commodity, desserts changed forever. Ice cream, sherbet, and chilled custards became the height of sophistication in 18th century Europe. Kings and queens competed for the most outrageous frozen treats, sometimes dyed in absurd colors or flavored with ingredients like violet or Parmesan cheese. Yes, you heard that right. Cheese ice cream. Even George Washington spent a small fortune importing ice cream molds and paying servants to keep his personal ice supply from melting. The wealthy were obsessed with the novelty of cold. A frozen dessert wasn't just delicious, it was proof you had the means to defy nature. Meanwhile, peasants were still gnawing on salt pork and turnips. But hey, someone had to keep history balanced. The psychology of freshness, then and now. Here's the strange thing. For most of human history, people didn't expect food to be fresh the way we do. They expected it to be stable, safe, non-lethal. That was enough. Milk wasn't pure white, it was a bit sour. Bread wasn't soft, it was dense. Meat wasn't pink, it was gray and salty. Only in the modern era did freshness become an obsession. Advertising campaigns in the early 20th century sold refrigeration as the key to purity, health, and cleanliness. Cold equals clean. That was the promise. But in doing so, we forgot something oddly profound. For thousands of years, our ancestors survived, thrived even, without the sterile perfection of chilled produce. They trusted salt, time, and instinct. Now, if our fridge dies for half a day, we panic and throw everything out. Progress is funny like that. The end of spoilage. Sort of. By the mid-20th century, refrigeration had conquered the world. From milk trucks to supermarket aisles, cold became normal. But it wasn't the end of preservation, it just changed the rules. Now, instead of fighting decay, we've simply postponed it. Everything's still temporary, just a little slower about it. Our ancestors used salt, smoke, and vinegar. We use voltage and sealed plastic. Different tools, same instinct. Protect the meal, protect ourselves. In a strange way, refrigeration didn't replace history's old methods, it became their modern descendant. Every hum of a fridge is the echo of an ice pit. Every frozen dinner is a continuation of some medieval monk's cheese wheel. Time moves forward, but our hunger and our fear of it never changes. So, as we close this sleepy journey, think of that next midnight snack, the cold drink, the crisp fruit, the leftovers waiting quietly in their frosty haven. They're not just convenience, they're history, frozen in time. And somewhere in the past, a tired peasant who just salted his last herring would be very impressed by your freezer. The age of odd preservation, when science met superstition. Hey again, still awake? Or maybe you've drifted into that perfect half-sleep, the kind where you're vaguely aware of a soothing voice talking about spoiled meat. Perfect. Stay there, because we're not done yet. We've covered salt, smoke, and the heroic ice collectors of history. But now, let's float gently into the stranger centuries, when humanity, ever curious, began experimenting with new ways to keep food from turning into regret. This was the era of desperate creativity. Some ideas worked. Some should have stayed in the sketchbook. Let's start with one of the weirdest culinary inventions ever, the coffin of butter. Butter buried alive. In the damp, green landscapes of medieval Ireland and Scotland, people discovered a remarkably efficient and slightly eerie method of preservation. They buried their butter. Yes, literally, in bogs. They'd wrap it in animal hide, seal it tight, and sink it into a peat bog for safekeeping. The cool, acidic, oxygen-free environment preserved the butter for years, sometimes even decades. Archaeologists have found bog butter that's over 1,000 years old. It's still recognizable, still butterish. Nobody's exactly volunteering to spread it on toast, but it's a testament to human stubbornness. Imagine some 9th century farmer thinking, well, the cows are gone for the winter, better just hide this in the swamp. And somehow, that worked. The art of pickling, and the eternal jar of mystery. Pickling might just be humanity's greatest equalizer. From Korean kimchi to Polish sauerkraut, nearly every civilization found a way to submerge vegetables in brine and call it a day. In medieval Europe, vinegar and salt water were the stars of the show. Vegetables, fruits, even meats, all pickled for months. There's something oddly meditative about it. You're not rushing to cook, you're letting time and microbes do their work. Monks, housewives, soldiers, Everyone had jars lined up somewhere quietly bubbling away. And for centuries, nobody really knew why it worked. They just trusted that sour equals safe. Pickling, in many ways, was the culinary version of faith. When the rich got bored, preserving with sugar. Meanwhile, in the castles and manors of the late Middle Ages, the wealthy had discovered an even sweeter secret: sugar. Imported from the East at obscene prices, sugar became both a luxury and a weapon against decay. Fruits, flowers, and even meats were candied and sealed in jars. Preserving food in sugar syrup created something magical, a shelf-stable treat that didn't need to be salted, smoked, or dried. Queen Elizabeth I reportedly loved candied violets and spiced marmalades. The nobility even dined on rose petals, crystallized ginger, and sugared almonds. But let's be honest, it was less about practicality and more about showing off. Preserving with sugar said, "Look how rich I am. I can afford to make my fruit immortal." The science of spoilage slowly entering the chat. By the 17th century, natural philosophers, basically early scientists with better wigs, began poking into the mysteries of rot. They didn't have microscopes yet, but they noticed that food decayed faster in the open, slower when sealed or dried. Some even suspected invisible creatures might be responsible. They weren't wrong, just ahead of their time. Then, in the 18th and early 19th centuries, came Nicolas Appert, a French confectioner who, while trying to win a government prize, accidentally invented modern food canning. He discovered that if you sealed food in a jar and boiled it, it lasted. No more daily panic about the state of your stew. Napoleon loved the idea, mostly because his armies could finally eat something that wasn't crawling away by the time it reached the front line. So began the age of the jar, and soon after, the age of the tin can. From tin to table. Industrial preservation. By the mid-1800s, industrial canning had exploded. Soldiers, sailors, explorers, they all carried tins of mystery meat, beans, and peaches. Of course, the process wasn't perfect. Early cans were hand-soldered with lead, and that went about as well as you'd expect. Some polar explorers literally died with bellies full of poisoned canned food, a tragic, metallic end. But progress marched on, one tin at a time. Factories began refining methods, improving seals, standardizing sterilization, and soon canned goods weren't just military rations, they were household staples. Now, for the first time, everyone could have shelf-stable food. The age-old anxiety of running out of fresh produce finally eased. Canning, in a quiet, unsung way, did for food what the printing press did for knowledge. It democratized it.
From ice to electricity, the birth of the modern kitchen. Let's take a slow breath and glide into the final act of this sleepy chronicle, the rise of the home refrigerator. For centuries, the idea of cold was tied to nature, to winter, mountains, and stored ice. But in the late 19th century, electricity rewrote the rules. And with that, the human obsession with control over time, decay, and nature finally found its perfect symbol. The first electric refrigerators, luxury for the brave. The earliest electric refrigerators appeared around 1913. They were clunky, loud, and often smelled faintly of ozone and danger. They were also expensive, the kind of thing only the wealthy could justify next to their phonograph and parlor palm. And people didn't trust them right away.
Imagine inviting guests over and proudly announcing, "I have a box that makes things cold all by itself." Sounds like witchcraft. But slowly, as the technology improved and prices dropped, the fridge became the centerpiece of the modern home. No more ice deliveries, no more spoiled milk by noon. The machine did what thousands of years of human effort had failed to do. It stopped rot in its tracks, or at least delayed it. Then came the ads. In the 1920s and 30s, companies began selling refrigeration not as luxury, but as morality. Cold means clean. Clean means good. Magazines were filled with pristine white kitchens, spotless housewives, and smiling children sipping milk that hadn't gone rogue. It was hygiene, modernity, and progress, all humming quietly behind a shiny metal door. And the message stuck. Freshness became a moral virtue. Stale became shameful. We'd finally won our battle with spoilage. But, as with most victories, we immediately turned it into status. The global cold chain, when the world went frosty. By mid-century, refrigeration spread everywhere. Not just homes, but trucks, ships, planes. Now, oranges from Spain could arrive fresh in London. Beef from Argentina could land on New York plates. Cold conquered distance. But, as always, it came with trade-offs. Energy use soared. Traditional preservation arts faded. The rhythm of seasonal eating disappeared under a layer of frost. We gained control and lost a little patience. Still, the miracle of cold remains quietly poetic. Every hum of a compressor, every puff of frosty air when you open the freezer, it's the sound of humanity keeping nature at arm's length, just enough to feel safe. The poetry of preservation, a quiet reflection. So here we are, centuries after the first salted fish, sitting beside machines that can simulate winter with the flick of a switch. And maybe, somewhere deep in our ancient memory, we still remember that primal fear of running out. Maybe that's why we hoard leftovers, why our pantries overflow, why the freezer hum is so comforting in the dark. Because for most of history, survival depended on knowing how to trick time. We've just gotten better tools. So next time you reach for that midnight snack, the chilled drink, the frozen pizza, the fruit that's traveled halfway around the planet, take a quiet moment. You're holding 1,000 years of ingenuity in your hand. And in its own sleepy, humming way, your refrigerator is whispering the same promise humans have always wanted to hear. You'll eat tomorrow, you'll be fine. So, that's it for tonight's story. From ancient salt pits to humming freezers, we've walked the long, cool path of human appetite and ingenuity. If you've made it this far, congratulations! You now know more about historical food storage than most medieval kings. Now close your eyes. Let the quiet hum of your room become your own private ice house. Sleep well, traveler. Your leftovers are safe.